Hello, historians, and welcome to your final lesson for Reconstruction. At this point, you have learned quite a bit, so for this very last lesson, we are going to be talking about the Jim Crow laws and practices. Important vocabulary that you need to know for this lesson are these four things. So we already learned about the 14th Amendment. That was in the very first lesson of this unit. Remember that the 14th Amendment gave African Americans the rights that are extended under the Bill of Rights because they are now citizens, and it prohibited them from losing life, liberty, and or property. So that's going to be really important when we look at the Jim Crow laws. You're also going to hear Jim Crow laws sometimes referred to as black codes. Black codes were the laws that were created essentially to try and recreate slavery without actually reinstating slavery, because slavery at this point is illegal. So sometimes Jim Crow laws and black codes are used kind of interchangeably. Next, we have Jim Crow. So when we talk about Jim Crow laws, it makes sense to know who Jim Crow is. Jim Crow was a satirical character who was created in 1832, and he portrayed black people in a comical way for white audiences. Now, sometimes, you hear those jokes that are super inappropriate and super not cool because they definitely tear somebody down for the sake of being funny. That was the whole purpose of Jim Crow. Jim Crow was a joke made in bad taste, but he soon became the mascot for segregation. And the phrase separate but equal, which you've heard since first or second grade when you talk about civil rights and Martin Luther King Jr., that phrase actually started back during the Reconstruction era when Jim Crow laws and black codes were put in to separate the races of black and white, and really every other race. And it created segregation. So we hear that phrase separate but equal. So we're going to talk a little bit about what that means. So first we need to set the stage, and when we say set the stage, we just mean kind of let's remind ourselves where we're starting. So at this point in time, African Americans are now considered citizens. We talked about the 14th Amendment and how that gave them protection underneath the Bill of Rights. We talked about how even though the 13th Amendment was passed and slavery was no longer legal, it wasn't until the 14th Amendment that they were really guaranteed rights and protection underneath the government. We talked about how after the assassination of President Lincoln, his vice president, Andrew Johnson, stepped up. And we talked about the fact that Andrew Johnson was a Southerner. He was also a very salty Southerner in the sense that he was a very vocal racist. He did not like black people. He felt like, and even said at one time that by trying to protect the rights of African Americans, that you're taking away the rights of whites, which is so far off. President Johnson, when he became president, he created a new all-white government in the South to make sure that black people could not run for office. And it looked very similar to the government of the Confederacy. He was really mad at the aristocratic whites from the South who had decided to secede, and he felt like had wronged him because he was the vice president of the United States, and those people were leaving the Union during the Civil War. So President Johnson is a very salty president, and he's going to make it his goal to try and stop African American progress. We also know that at this point, because African Americans have been freed from slavery, that they're trying to find ways to establish independent and successful lives in the United States. And one of the most important things that they need in order to do that is the ability to vote, which they got under the 15th Amendment. And it makes the most sense that if you have the ability to vote, you can vote for the people who represent your beliefs and values, just like we do today. So it was important to them to not be electing people like President Johnson, who at this point is part of the Democratic Party. Democrats and Republicans do not have the same meaning as they do today back then. At this point in time, the Democratic Party was the pro-segregation party, whereas the Republicans were deemed radical because they were trying to integrate the races and provide equality amongst blacks and whites in the United States. So African Americans now have the right to vote according to the 15th Amendment. But just like many of the other freedoms that they were given, loopholes were found, and we're going to talk about kind of what some of those loopholes are. So first we need to know, who was Jim Crow. We kind of talked about this already in the vocabulary side, but he was created in 1832. The important thing to know about Jim Crow was how he portrayed African Americans. He portrayed them as unintelligent, lazy, and easily controlled. In the beginning, Jim Crow was actually the character in a song. So a lot of depictions of African Americans at this time, they're depicted playing instruments and singing songs that are really just meant to entertain audiences, who in this point are mostly white audiences. Remember, we talk in language arts about hyperbole, and hyperbole is an exaggeration. Jim Crow is what we call a hyperbolic character. He was this really gross exaggeration of African Americans at the time, and it's important to note that this hyperbole was created by white people. It was not created by a black person who was trying to emphasize the good traits of African Americans. It was created by white people in a sense to emphasize the negative traits of African Americans. And Jim Crow later becomes the mascot for segregation. When we talk about segregation and separate but equal, and separate facilities, we talk about Jim Crow and these Jim Crow laws. So over here you do have an illustration of the original Jim Crow. Notice things are really, really exaggerated about the way that he looks, and he just kind of looks overall silly. They were trying to make African Americans appear not serious. They were not serious players at this time, is what this whole caricature is meant to represent. So as a result of all of these African Americans gaining these new laws, you had people who were going to try and create new laws to kind of counteract it. Jim Crow laws held these beliefs. They held the beliefs that whites were superior to blacks. Jim Crow laws made it to where violence was an acceptable means to keep blacks in check. Whites and blacks should never have children. A white man and a black man should not so much as shake hands with one another. Jim Crow laws and black codes created the belief that races should be separate. So you see over here, we've got an example. You've got your colored water fountain. We see that over here you've got different, not only just for colors, but also for gender and sex. We see that women are on a different side and men are on the other. And not only that, but then on each side they're split into colored or white. And we know that over time, the idea of separate but equal became a lot less equal. Here's some examples of some black codes, just to give you an idea of almost how extreme these laws really were. This first one says, no Negro shall be permitted to preach, exhort, or otherwise declaim to congregations of colored people without special permission in writing from the president of the police jury, who, you guessed it, is white. So this is basically saying that in churches, you cannot have a black pastor, which is kind of crazy. This next one says, every Negro is required to be in the regular service of some white person or former owner, hello, slavery, who shall be held responsible for the conduct of said Negro, but said employer of or former owner may permit said Negro to hire his own time by special permission in writing, which permission shall not extend over 7 days at any one time. Okay, guys, this is pretty much slavery right here. This is slavery with one special privilege down here, that they can have their own time for no more than 7 days. It's a little crazy. Whoop. And then this final one says, no Negro shall be permitted to rent or keep a house within said parish. So this black code is from the state of Louisiana. Any Negro violating this provision shall be immediately ejected and compelled to find an employer. A white person, guys. And any person who shall rent or give the use of any house to any Negro in violation of this section shall pay a fine of $5 for each offense. This is basically segregating neighborhoods, okay? This is saying that only white people can live in this neighborhood. If a white person is found renting to a black person within this neighborhood, then those people can be fined, okay? These are examples of black codes. And these are not the only examples of black codes. In the South, there were different black codes for each state, and these three, I believe, are from the state of Louisiana. So in order to remove the newly won rights of African Americans, radical groups used fear tactics to attempt to return African Americans to their former state of subjugation, essentially slavery. The Ku Klux Klan was created at this time. They attempted to keep African Americans from voting for Republican candidates. Remember, those are the ones who wanted to create equality. They initiated things like poll taxes and literacy tests. Remember when we talked about sharecropping? It was hard at this time for African Americans, who most of the time were sharecroppers, to make any sort of profit. So in order to vote, they had to pay this special tax, which African Americans didn't really have at the time. Also required them to pass literacy tests, which, if you do recall, slaves up to this point were never allowed to be educated, and some black codes actually prohibited African Americans from being educated. So it would be impossible for them to go up to vote and have to take this long written test about things that most white people at the time could not pass either. If you look over here at this picture, this is a really good example. You see this white man here, and if you can even try and read it, it says education qualifications, okay? It says the black man is ordered to be educated, which you know that is not how we spell educated, in order for him to vote with us whites, okay? The ironic thing here is that this white man is obviously also not educated, but the white men were not required to pass the literacy tests. Okay, so this is another example of now we're creating these special loopholes. Remember, we talked about all these loopholes that were meant to separate the races. And if they could keep African Americans from voting, then they could ensure that candidates who were for the equality of African Americans would not win. Okay, so see, it's this downward spiral that now we're going to get this big democratic government in the South, so that African Americans cannot be advanced. They're going to elect people who are not going to take away their black codes and their Jim Crow laws, so that things can kind of stay as they were. Okay, this is a really great cartoon about these new laws that are instituted on African Americans and all minorities, really. We see that the minorities are represented as this elderly woman, and she's going to have to jump over all of these hurdles to get to the polling place, okay? This would have been impossible for African Americans at the time. It essentially creates an unfair advantage for white Americans who are voting versus black Americans who are trying to vote. It almost makes it to where it's impossible for them to vote, which means it's impossible for candidates who represent their interests to win. So what became segregated because of Jim Crow laws? The answer is everything. Okay, schools, hospitals, hotels, water fountains, bathrooms, trains, waiting rooms, buses, churches, restaurants, restrooms, movie theaters, stores, neighborhoods, etc. Everything is becoming segregated. And we're clinging to this idea that things are going to be separate but equal. Plessy versus Ferguson is a famous court case that happened at this time that basically made segregation legal as long as the facilities were equal. The problem was it was very, very rare that these facilities were equal. You've seen pictures when you've learned about civil rights in the past of water fountains like this one. Okay, we have over here the colored water fountain and the white water fountain. They're definitely separate, but are they equal? Definitely not. Okay, so this was kind of the clause that they used to keep segregation legal. It was illegal for for an entire century. Okay, so 100 years of subjugation of one race because of the color of their skin. Okay, and just to wrap it up, I want you to think about it. So even though segregation is illegal in 2017, can you think of some things or places that have stayed segregated even today? So I want you to think on it. We're going to talk about this when we do our lesson on Jim Crow laws. So I want you to just come up with some ideas. What are some things that you do see clear division in races, whether it's intentional or not? And we are going to talk about it. So guys, I hope you enjoyed this lesson. I hope that you learned some things. It's not the happiest of lessons, but it's one that we have to do nonetheless. So that being said, guys, I hope you have a great day, and I will see you guys tomorrow.